Hi there, my name is Mark Connors and I'm the planning director for the town of Stratham. And I'm going to spend a little time today going through the proposed zoning amendments with you that be on the town ballot for the town election in March. You might wonder why every year there are so many amendments you have to vote on. And that's because the zoning amendments, the zoning ordinance and the building ordinance, the only way to make any kind of change to that document is to go through this process to have it approved by the voters. So these amendments have been proposed by the planning board, and the planning board over the course of really a whole year comes across items they'd like to make some changes to, and spends a lot of time kind of going through the ordinance and proposing changes and kind of reworking what those changes will look like. So these amendments are kind of the end process of that, which started back in the spring of last year. So there are 9 ballots on the ballot this year, and I'll just jump into the first one, which on the ballot will be Article 2, and this relates to sections of the ordinance called definitions and table of uses. This is something I would consider a housekeeping amendment because these are pretty minor changes that we're proposing. The first part of this is to add definitions for 2 terms. One is for mixed-use development and one is for half-story. And I'll just briefly describe what those are. So we realized we didn't have a good definition in the ordinance for mixed-use development. So we actually had one approved by the board this year. So this picture you're looking at is just north of Smythe Park. It's a historic building. I believe it used to be a home, and it's been converted into office space. And the owner proposed putting residential in the back part of that property. So there's 2 apartments behind that building. And this is a type of project I think the planning board would like to see more of along the main corridors in town. It kind of provides a mix of uses along Portsmouth Avenue. But we realized we didn't have really a good definition for what exactly a mixed-use development is, so we have provided that. And it's simply a complementary mix of building uses. And it does require for certain zones in Stratham, so for example, the Gateway District, it does require that commercial make up at least 25% of the floor area of the building or the property, because the planning board wants to ensure that we do have a healthy commercial base to support our tax base. The other definition is for a half-story. A half-story, this picture is another good example. It's really any situation where you have a building with a peaked roof. So you have, in this case, the main building, there's a 3rd floor. And that space is always smaller than the floors on the bottom that has to deal with that kind of pitched roof. So this just provides a definition for half-story, because that's a term that we have a fair amount of in the zoning ordinance, because the planning board wants to encourage pitched roof type of architecture in town, and mixes well with our existing residential. And then the last part of this is especially housekeeping nature. It makes some minor changes to our definition of structure to better align that definition with more recent changes to the state building code. And moving on to Article 3, this is a proposed change to the building ordinance, and this would clarify that the building inspector has the authority to require a plan prepared by a professional. So in this case, either a licensed land surveyor or a certified wetland scientist. When there is a pending building permit application and the building inspector has a reasonable basis to believe that it might not align with our zoning ordinance, our building ordinance, with the building and fire codes. So there's a question, for example, if you're proposing addition to your house and the building inspector is worried it might encroach into the wetland setback, he could require that you provide a plan to support your building permit application. Or, for example, if you're proposing addition and it's close to the rear property boundary and he wants to ensure that it meets that setback. That's another case where this might come into play. I will note that this is an administrative process, so if you disagreed with the building inspector's interpretation, you didn't feel like a plan was necessary, because that is a little bit of an additional expense, you could appeal that decision, and the zoning board of adjustment would be the final kind of arbiter of whether or not that plan would be required or not. We'll move on to Article 4, which relates to home occupations. Home occupations are relatively common in Stratham. These are home businesses that are typically businesses where you have customers going to your business that are in part of a home, part of a residential district. They're typically very small scale type businesses. So you might have a barber or office or something like that. It's not for work from home. So there's a lot of folks in Stratham who work from home, either fully or on a hybrid basis. We don't require anyone to get a permit to do that. So these changes wouldn't affect you. It's just for these larger type of businesses that are operating in residential districts. So currently our ordinance requires that these permits be renewed every 3 years. But we didn't have a very good process in place for what exactly that looked like, when exactly those documents are due. So this makes some, I would say, fairly minor changes to this part of the ordinance to require when that documentation is submitted. It also requires the town to send the owner a reminder, so that you'll receive written documentation that this is a process you have to renew. And there's a grace period, so if you don't actually meet the that deadline of 3 years, you have 90 days in which to get the paperwork in. If it doesn't get in that time period, you'd have to start the process over. It would essentially expire, and you have to apply for a new home occupation. And the second part of this change is it would cap the size of home occupations to 1,000 square feet, no more than 1,000 square feet. So the current requirement is it can't be any more than 25% of the floor area of the building, and that's our current cap. But we have some situations where homes are larger than 4,000 square feet. So this, regardless of how large your home is, you can't go more than that 1,000 square feet. And the reasoning for this is because these businesses are operating in residential districts. So we do want smaller scale businesses that are going to fit in with the residential character of the neighborhood. And if the business is expanding, probably a good idea to look at potentially relocating to a commercial district in town. So that's Article 4. Article 5 relates to conditional use permits. Conditional use permit is a fairly common application that the planning board reviews. Essentially, if you're applying for a conditional use permit, you have to meet all of the criteria of the required of the conditional use permit. And we're not going to go through all of the criteria because there's 11 currently, but they deal with things like impacts to the abutting neighborhood, if there's a aesthetic impact from what you're proposing, or any kind of real impacts to the town, or particularly the surrounding neighborhood. So as I said, this is a fairly common application, and in order to be granted a conditional use permit, you have to meet all 11 criteria. So when the planning board reviews these applications, they have to go through all 11 of those criteria. And it takes quite a bit of time for the board to get through that process. So this is, again, I would consider a bit of a housekeeping amendment in that there's really not any major substantive changes being proposed. We are proposing to consolidate those criteria down to 7. Essentially, what we're doing is taking part of those 11 and condensing those into the 7. So I don't think we're really not losing any critical parts of the review criteria. It'll just make it a less cumbersome process for the planning board when they do have to review these applications. That's Article 5. Article 6 relates to cluster open space subdivisions. This is a fairly common type of development that we have here in Stratham. It's where a development is proposed where you have smaller lot sizes, so smaller than 2 acres, and oftentimes a lot smaller than 2 acres. So you might see lots of half an acre or somewhere in that area. But then that excess area is utilized for open space. Typically on the peripheries of development to provide a little bit of buffer from the surrounding neighborhoods. And often there's some kind of large open space for the residents that homeowner association manages that property, and the homeowners have the right to use it for recreational purposes or things like that, but they have to maintain it as open space. It can never be developed. And this is popular because a couple things. The developer, if they propose development like this, they can get a density bonus. So that can be beneficial to the developer, often for the abutting property owners, since this requires a buffer around the development. It's preferable for them because they get, they're ensured that they're getting some screening from the development they'll be going in. So they are fairly popular. There is no minimum lot size. You do have to, the overall development has to meet a certain density threshold, but the lot size itself, there's no current requirements on minimum lot size. And we found that when people purchase into developments like this, they often want the same types of amenities that folks with larger lots want. So often they're looking to have pool installed or detached garage and things like that. And when you're on a very small lot, that's a lot to put on a lot, particularly when you have well and septic already on the lot. So we're proposing minimum lot size based on utilities on the lot. So if you have a well and you have septic, we're requiring a larger lot size, at least an acre, and then that goes down based on whatever utilities you have on the lot. So that's the first part of this. The second part is additional requirements associated with screening. So those buffer areas I was talking about, currently they're on some private properties. We found that's a little bit of a challenge from an enforcement perspective because when a person owns a property, they sometimes don't realize that there's restrictions on parts of their land. So what we're proposing is to require that buffer be part of the HOA land, so it not be part of the private lots. We're also requiring that the open space parcel I was talking about that's shared between the homeowners, that space is not more than 20% wetlands. And finally, if there's a historic building or some kind of major historical resource on the property, when it's proposed for development, we're proposing requiring that resource be preserved as part of the development. That is at all feasible. So that's Article 6 in a nutshell. Article 7 relates to sheds or small accessory structures. This creates a new allowance for smaller sheds, so 120 square feet or less. This allows for reduced setbacks, 5 feet for the side or rear property boundaries, and 15 feet from wetlands. If the application meets a couple minimum criteria, so you can't have a permanent foundation associated with the shed. It has to be 120 square feet or less. It can't be taller than 12 feet for the top of the roof peak. And it has to be part of a residential property. It can't be part of a commercial site plan. And you're only allowed one per parcel. So that's a new allowance that Article 7 would create. Article 8 relates to maximum residential density. This is something that applies mostly to our commercial districts in Stratham. For the most part, the town allows mixed-use development. And there are restrictions on density, but it's more generous than what you find in our traditional single-family residential neighborhoods. But this clarifies that non-buildable areas, so those are wetlands, steep slopes, or areas that are protected by conservation easements, those areas can't be used when you're calculating the maximum density, because obviously you can't build on those parts of the property. It seems to make sense that they wouldn't be included when you're calculating that residential density. And the second part of this article, it would reduce the maximum density in the Route 33 Heritage District down from 3 units per acre, reduce that down to 2 units per acre. That's still that's still a bonus compared to the surrounding residential areas. But the rationale here was that this would bring that down to something that we think would blend in a little bit better with the surrounding residential neighborhoods, which have a higher density threshold. I'm sorry, a lower density threshold. So the idea is that if there are developments going on in the heritage district, that they blend in with the surroundings. So that's Article 8. Article 9 relates to small-scale solar energy systems. So currently, if Stratham, if you're proposing one of these are ground-mounted systems. If you're proposing one on your property, you have to get approval from the planning board. And this amendment, if it passes, would allow you to be able to build these by right. If you met a number of criteria, so you could potentially just go ahead and pull a building permit instead of having to go have the proposal reviewed and approved by the planning board. But the application have to meet a number of minimum criteria. That includes it has to be in the rear yard of the property only. It would have to be at least 35 feet from any property boundary and comply with our wetland setbacks. It couldn't involve clear cutting or removal of mature trees that are within 20 feet of any property boundary. The solar array would be capped at a maximum of 12 feet. And this is oriented for residential properties. So this is part of commercial property, you still have to go through the planning board process. So that's Article 9 in a nutshell. Article 10 deals with accessory outside storage. So this is that illustration on the right is a storage container. You see more of these. People have often in commercial sites, but you do see them occasionally in residential areas. People have them on their property for storage. This article also relates to semi-trailers, so that's typically the back part of a tractor trailer. It also govern large dumpsters and large campers or RVs. And essentially this would require screening of these if they're on residential properties, or that they be in the rear yard of the property. And this does exempt campers and RVs that are considered roadworthy. So if the vehicle has current state registration, and if it's passed state inspection within the past 15 months, then it would be exempt from the requirements. So you could continue to have that in your driveway, for example. So that essentially covers Article 10 in a nutshell. And that's the final amendment you'll be voting on in the ballot this year. I hope this was informative. Again, my name is Mark Connors, the Director of the Planning Community Development program here. My contact information is on this slide. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you very much for watching this, and hope you have a good time voting.